We're going to read 1 Samuel 29, beginning in verse 1. Now the Philistines gathered together all their armies to Aphek, while the Israelites were camping by the spring which is in Jezreel. And the lords of the Philistines were proceeding on by hundreds and by thousands, and David and his men were proceeding on in the rear with Achish. Then the commanders of the Philistines said, "What are these Hebrews doing here?" And Achish said to the commanders of the Philistines, "Is this not David, the servant of Saul, the king of Israel, who has been with me these days, or rather these years? And I have found no fault in him from the day he deserted to me to this day." But the commanders of the Philistines were angry with him. And the commanders of the Philistines said to him, "Make the man go back, that he may return to his place where you have assigned him. And do not let him go down to battle with us, or in the battle he may become an adversary to us. For with what could this man make himself acceptable to his Lord? Would it not be with the heads of these men? Is this not David, of whom they sing in the dances, saying, 'Saul is slain his thousands, and David his 10,000s?'" Then Achish called David and said to him, "As the Lord lives, you have been upright, and your going out and your coming in with me in the army are pleasing in my sight. For I have not found evil in you from the day of your coming to me to this day. Nevertheless, you are not pleasing in the sight of the lords. Now therefore return, and go in peace, that you may not displease the lords of the Philistines." David said to Achish, "But what have I done? And what have you found in your servant from the day when I came before you to this day, that I may not go and fight against the enemies of my lord the king?" But Achish replied to David, "I know that you are pleasing in my sight, like an angel of God. Nevertheless, the commanders of the Philistines have said, 'He must not go up with us to battle.' Now then, arise early in the morning with the servants of your Lord who have come with you, and as soon as you have arisen early in the morning and have light, depart." So David arose early, he and his men, to depart in the morning to return to the land of the Philistines. And the Philistines went up to Jezreel.
I was at a baseball game recently, and at one point in the game, a runner got caught between two bases, where they throw the ball back and forth to try to tag him out. And the technical term for that, if you know baseball, is a rundown. And usually it doesn't end well for the runner. They get caught. Well, as soon as it happened, and everybody realized what was going on, I noticed the older guy behind me, he didn't call it a rundown. He said something else. He kind of blurted out loud and said, "Boy, he's in a real pickle now." Which, by the way, it occurred to me, if English is your second language, that is a really confusing sentence to hear a person say. Well, he was right. That guy, that runner, was in a pickle. Even if you don't play baseball, you've probably been in a pickle before. It means to be in a mess, right? To be in a tough spot, to be in a difficult situation. Maybe you aren't being level-headed or clear-headed, and so you do something knuckle-headed, thick-headed, bone-headed, hot-headed, or pin-headed, and you don't know where you're headed. And no matter what, you find yourself going, I wish I wasn't here, but now what am I going to do? We could probably think of lots of examples. You could imagine, you have a little tiff with your spouse, and later that day, though, a friend from church reaches out and says, "Hey, man, right now I could really use some marriage advice." And you're thinking, "Not now." Right? I don't feel like I'm in a good position to say anything, right? I don't feel like I can handle this at this moment. We've all been in situations like that. And if you've ever been there, then 1 Samuel chapter 29 is a chapter for you. Because the last time we saw David, you may remember, he was in a real pickle. David found himself, or more accurately, David put himself in a very difficult, seemingly impossible situation. If you haven't been here, I'll get you caught up to speed. To understand chapter 29, you got to go back a couple of chapters and remember what we saw before this. If you work backwards, David, he found himself agreeing to fight with the Philistines against Israel. And that started because David was lying to the Philistines. Well, that started because David was hiding among the Philistines, and that started because David told his heart, there is nothing better for me to do than to go live among the Philistines. And so David let his fears and his feelings get the best of him, and they put him in this situation where David was stuck between a rock and a hard place. If he doesn't follow through, the Philistines might kill him. And if he does follow through, the Israelites might reject him. In fact, if you think about it, David has repeatedly said that he will not lift his hand against the Lord's anointed, right? He has said that over and over again. But if David is on the battlefield when the Lord's anointed, when Saul dies, doesn't that look suspicious? Hasn't he put himself in a tough spot? Are people really going to believe when, by the way, he's lined up on the Philistine side? So we left off last time wondering, what is David going to do? On the one hand, he can't fight against Israel, but on the other hand, he has agreed to fight against Israel. How is he going to get out of this terrible situation? Well, I think there's only one answer to that question. And it's the answer that we will see as this text here unfolds. I don't want to tell you what it is now. I want you to look for it. I want you to see if you can discover what's going to happen in this passage. As the chapter begins, notice verse 1 tells us that it's the Philistines versus the Israelites again. This is not their first battle in the book, but this actually will be their last battle in the book. They've lined up from east to west in the Jezreel Valley, and they have cut the nation of Israel in half. They're going to divide and conquer. It's a very strategic battle. And we notice there in verse 1, it says, the Philistines gathered together all their armies to Aphek. So this is not just Gath or Ashdod or Ekron or one of those. This is all 5 of them. All the armies have amassed. It's a huge gathering of soldiers. And we see in verse 2, the lords of the Philistines were proceeding on by hundreds and by thousands. It's a united front, a sea of soldiers going out to square off against God's people. So they not only have this strong coalition, the Philistines also have a secret weapon. Verse 2, and David and his men were proceeding on in the rear with Achish. Achish is the king of the Philistines. Now, why is David in the back of the pack here? Why is he lined up on the Philistine side? Well, you may remember when he fled to Philistia, they gave him a city, and David got a promotion. Back in chapter 28, the Achish made him his, quote, personal bodyguard. Now, think about that. How crazy is that? Here we have the Lord's anointed who is working in the Philistine secret service. I mean, imagine Donald Rumsfeld joining the Taliban. Like that seems so insane. And yet David is lined up on the other side with the enemies. Now, why would David do this? Why did he think in his heart this was his best plan of action? Well, it's possible, as we'll see, maybe it's a whole ruse, maybe he's lying to get one over in them, that's possible. But I heard another preacher point something out that I thought made a lot of sense. He pointed out that all of this shady stuff in David's life started in chapter 25. Do you remember chapter 25? You don't have to turn there. Do you remember what happened? Do you remember that whole Nabal thing? Remember David got hot-headed and was going to kill this guy for basically nothing? And then you remember at the end of that chapter, David, he marries multiple wives. And then you remember he again runs to Philistia, and he lies and he deceives and he sheds blood, and then he finds himself aligning with him. all of that stuff started with chapter 25. But do you remember how chapter 25 started? Verse 1. Then Samuel died. Do you see it? It's as if the death of Samuel sends David spiraling. Remember, this book is not called 1 David. It's called 1 Samuel. And so this is the shadow, the presence of Samuel is even hanging over all of this. David has been acting, he's been acting like the death of the prophet means the death of the promise. He is acting in a very uncharacteristic way. He appears to have lost hope. He appears to not be trusting God. He appears to be unsure of God's plan. Well, even if David does not believe in God's plan, my friends, the good news is this: God believes in God's plan. God is still going to work despite David making these choices. Despite David putting himself in this compromising position, the Lord is up to something in all of this. So David lines up and they go out to battle, and the Philistine commanders, they look over and they see David and his 600 men with them, and they feel kind of weird about this. So in verse 3, they said, "What are these Hebrews doing here?" The original, by the way, here, the original language only has 3 words there, and it says something like this: "What? These Hebrews?" They're just flabbergasted by this. What are these guys doing here? Do you not realize they're part of the other side? Most scholars, by the way, agree that there's probably a little bit of insult in that their word choice, a bit of a racial or ethnic slur by not calling them Israelites, but kind of pejoratively calling them Hebrews. There's a hint of anger, a hint of frustration, but even maybe a hint of prejudice in what they say. And by the way, while I'm here, let me just go on the record for whatever it's worth. Anti-Semitism is a fancy word for an ugly sin. The church should have absolutely nothing to ever do with it. Our Lord Jesus Christ is of the tribe of Judah, and to support anti-Semitism is to literally be anti-Christ. It's bad when Philistines are bigots, but it is even worse for Christians to be bigots. And these Hebrews, they see with a bit of a slur, with a little bit of an insult, how dare those Hebrews join us in this? So they make their way out. And as they object, Achish, though, he defends them. Verse 3, Achish said, "Is this not David, the servant of Saul, the king of Israel, who's been with me these days, or rather these years, and I found no fault in him from the day he deserted to me this day?" So Achish thinks he's actually defected, that he's actually flipped sides. We can tell from what he says there. But Achish defends him in this. Now, let's be honest. Maybe I'm wrong, but based on everything I've seen in the book of 1 Samuel, Achish is not the brightest bulb in the box. All right? David has hoodwinked him already. You know, remember several chapters ago, the whole slobber and beard business, right? He got one over on him there. And it's very possible that, again, this guy Achish, he's either really optimistic, but kind of naive. And he's only seeing what is part of the picture here. In fact, notice he says there, "Is this not David?" Listen to his words, "the servant of Saul?" You can imagine his commanders going, "Yeah, duh. Did you not hear what you just said? He is the servant of Saul. In fact, we've heard, the rumor has it, he has repeatedly refused to kill Saul. Why do you think he's going to help us kill Saul?" And they find themselves frustrated by this. In fact, verse 4 says, the commanders of the Philistines were angry with him. They are ticked off at Achish and ticked off at David and ticked off at this whole situation. And they say in this verse, look, make the man go back, verse 4, that he may return to his place where you've assigned him. That's Ziklag. We'll see that next week. Go back to that city. Or, look at this, in the battle, he may become an adversary to us. Now catch this. That word there in the original Hebrew, you know what word that is? They said, or he will become the Satan to us. The Satan is the adversary, the enemy, right? The one on the other side. And so they're looking at this going, this guy is not good news. This guy is going to turn on us. We suspect this guy is going to come against us. And to make their point, they then break out into song and dance and start singing that Israelite pop song, verse 5. Is this not David of whom they sing in the dances? Saul has slain his thousands, and David his 10,000s? I can almost see his commanders going, Achish, Achish, Achish. You know the song, right? Listen, let's sing it together, okay? Saul has slain his thousands, and David his 10,000 what? It's not Israelites. It's Philistines, right? And by the way, that song's like 10 years old now, and they're still singing it, right? From the time of Goliath to now, his reputation is a widowmaker among the Philistines. And he says, Achish, anybody, do you not see? This guy is probably not on our side. And I think these Philistines, I think they're dead on. I think they're perceptive because we've already seen David was an opportunist by using the Canaanite city to attack other Canaanite cities. So they're on to something. So these Philistine commanders, they know what's up. They are not dim-witted, even though that might work for a guy who is, it seems like. So the Philistines, they decide to take a vote. And the war council overrules Achish the king. And they decide he can't go to battle with us. So Achish has to break the bad news to him. Verse 6, then Achish called David and said to him, as the Lord lives, you have been upright, and your going out and your coming in with me in the army are pleasing in my sight. I have not found evil in you from the day of your coming to me to this day. Now, first of all, let's appreciate the fact, notice how he starts his apology. As what? As the Lord lives. He doesn't swear by Dagon. He doesn't swear in the name of Baal. He swears in the name of Yahweh. He invokes the name of the one true God. Now, I don't think that makes him a convert, because otherwise he wouldn't be fighting against the Israelites. But clearly, David's God has left an impression on him. And so he swears in the name of of Yahweh, and then he tells him, I've seen nothing evil in you. Nevertheless, verse 6, you're not pleasing in the sight of the Lord's. Now therefore return and go in peace, that you may not displease the lords of the Philistines. Now, do you see what's happening here? Right? How did this whole story started? It started with David in this pickle, in this lose-lose situation, where he can't go fight against Israel as the Lord's anointed, and yet he had agreed to fight against Israel. And now he finds himself, David, even though he put himself in the situation, now all of a sudden he's going to get off the hook. Now he's going to find himself being actually let go. And this pagan king in the process is apologizing to him. I am so sorry we can't take you to battle with us. He's practically groveling before David. And so this lose-lose situation is flipped around into this win-win situation. I mean, this had to be abundantly above and beyond all that David could have asked or thought. This was the solution that no one could have imagined. By the way, doesn't that show us something not just about Achish or about David? Doesn't that show us something about our God? What did Paul say? In Romans chapter 11, verse 33, oh, the depths of the riches of both the wisdom and knowledge of God, how unfathomable are his ways. Isn't that true? God's way, we couldn't plan something better than the way God in his sovereignty works in our lives. God can see what we can't see. He is not just smart, He is all-knowing. He is not just strong, He is all-powerful. And for you and me, the journey of faith is knowing that God can do surprising things in surprising ways at surprising times. And David finds himself in just such a situation. By the way, if you don't believe that God can do surprising things in surprising ways at surprising times, just ask Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Just ask Joseph. Just ask Daniel. The list goes on and on. His ways are not our ways, and His thoughts are not our thoughts. David could not have arranged this better. And yet we see that in this moment, Achish says to him, all right, you need to go. So he apologizes to him. And I just imagine David standing there dumbfounded, trying to figure out what just happened. He says in verse 8, David said to Achish, but what have I done? And what have you found in your servant from the day when I came before you to this day, that I may not go and fight against the enemies of my Lord, the king? Sort of like, you ever have one of those moments when, I know I'm the only one. I'm not the only one. When you agree to do something, and then you get to the day and you're like, I don't really want to do this. You know, like whether it's go to dinner or go to something, right? And then something else is actually going to happen. You're like, oh man, I really want to do that. And then right before the first person calls and says, oh, plans got changed, we can't go. And you're like, oh, I am so disappointed. Right? Like you're trying to not give away, right? David's response, what have I done? And what have you found in me, right? It's like David is trying to, how do I respond in this situation? Now, this might be a sincere objection, but there also might be something else in here. Look at the end of verse 8. He says, that I may not go and fight against, who does he say? The enemies of my Lord, the king. Now, who's he talking about there? Well, it seems like he's talking about Achish, and he could be. But we know that David has used that exact phrase 3 other times in the book to talk about who? Saul. He has called Saul my Lord the king over and over. And it's as if David is playing it cool here, but saying, I really wanted to go to battle so that I could fight against the enemies. And yet Achish says, no, that's not the case. Achish then doubles down on his apology, verse 9. But Achish replied to David, I know that you're pleasing in my sight like an angel of God. This guy is a fanboy. Man, I tell you what, he can't get enough David, right? I mean, he is just enamored with him. And he says, nevertheless, the commanders of the Philistines have said he must not go with us to battle. So Achish says, no, you're off the hook. By the way, again, there's so many layers to this. I wish I could talk about it. What did they say earlier? He will be an adversary to us. And he says, no, he is an angel, right? But the adversary is what? The literal word is Satan, and Satan was an angel. It's like an Abbott and Costello, like who's on first? It's like, okay, they're all right, but they're also all not right. You know, it's like the irony is found in the dialogue and how careful they're choosing their words here. So David finds himself getting let go. And Achish is defending him. This pagan king is saying, no, there's nothing between us. I want you to go in peace. By the way, what Achish does here in defending David, it reminds me of somebody else. Do you remember another Gentile leader who insisted that the Lord's anointed was innocent? You remember Pilate? Right? What everybody around him saying he's guilty. And Pilate said, I find no fault in this man. This man is innocent. In fact, guess how many times they both did it? 3 times. 3 times Achish says he's innocent, he's innocent, he's innocent, much like what Pilate did. But my friends, unlike David, the Lord Jesus Christ, he was truly innocent. There was no deceit found in his mouth, no sin upon him. And yet God, as he used Pilate, as God used Achish, God is not required to use his own people to accomplish his purposes. He is that sovereign. And he can even use these men to bring about his ultimate plan. So Achish says, hey man, like, you're off the hook. You can go. And so he says in verse 10, now then arise early in the morning with the servants of your Lord who've come with you, and as soon as you have arisen early in the morning and have light, depart. So David arose, he and his men, to depart in the morning. By the way, just a little small note here. Notice how often the text is saying here that David left when? In the morning. You say, why are you pointing that out? Do you remember where we left Saul last time at the end of chapter 28? He departed when? At night. Saul goes off into the darkness. But David is coming out at the dawning of a new day. It's like the book as a whole is coming to this point where the fall of Saul and the rise of David is found even in the light of the passage. Saul is going to his judgment, going to his grave, going to this battle where he will die, and yet David is ascending towards the throne because God's plan and God's purposes will come to be. And even though David created this mess, even though David put himself in this awkward position, even though David made these foolish decisions, God's word and God's promise are going to come true. And God is more committed even than David is to bringing him to the throne. You know, we started this passage by pointing out that David, like that guy in that baseball game I mentioned, we looked at David and said, boy, he is in a real pickle. Right? How's he going to get out of this? Can I ask you a question? How on earth does the future king of Israel get honorably discharged from the Philistine army? There's only one answer to that. God's mercy. God's mercy. I think that's the answer to this chapter. I think that's what's happening. Even though it's not mentioned in name, mercy is a very quiet work of God. It often goes unseen in our lives. And the mercy of God is present here, delivering David not only from the Philistines, but more importantly, delivering David from himself. Delivering him from this situation. And my friends, God's mercy operates in our lives in this same kind of quiet, subtle ways, and we don't always see it. In fact, when we see it, we often mislabel it. I'll show you what I mean. Imagine, probably many of you had, you're driving along one day, you listen to a podcast or music, whatever. You're not really paying attention, just driving along, and the speed limit changes, but you didn't really see it, and then you realize you passed a cop, right? And then we're doing ba-boom, 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 right? And you look in your rearview mirror, and you see that needle's too high, and you're, no, right? And you're kind of checking all your mirrors and seeing, did he get behind me, and you slam on the brakes and slow down, right? And you're going along, and you keep looking, and you keep looking, and you keep watching, and you keep watching, and he doesn't pull out. And you sit there for a second, and you go, whew, right? You breathe a sigh, and then what do you say? We say, man, I was lucky. Isn't that what we say sometimes? Isn't that what we think? My friends, that is not the luck of man. That is the mercy of God. That's mercy. The mercy of God is at work in 1,000 ways that we don't see, holding back countless little judgments that come our way. Situations where we have acted impulsively or foolishly, and yet God's mercy there, like a rudder on a ship, you can't see it, but under the surface it is steering us and keeping us from running aground or crashing our lives completely. God's mercy is constantly at work in us, and I think David recognized this. It's not in this passage, I understand that. But what did he write in that famous psalm, Psalm 23, verse 6? Surely goodness and mercy shall what? Follow me all the days of my life. That Hebrew word there for follow is actually not strong enough. It's actually more like pursue, chase. Surely mercy will chase me all the days of my life. Surely mercy will come after me all the days of my life. Even though I mess things up, even though David is saying, mercy followed me into Philistia. Mercy followed me as I was walking next to Achish. Mercy was there in the valley of Jezreel. Mercy was present as they were having their war council. The mercy of God was at work to bring him through this situation. My friends, the mercy of God is doing the same in your life too. Do you recognize God's big mercy in those little moments? I tell you how to know whether or not you recognize it is how do you talk about it? When you retell those stories like the driving story, do you give God the credit or do you just say, whew, I dodged a bullet? Do you say, man, I hit my brakes fast enough? Man, I'm cunning enough. I'm smart enough. Or did you stop and say, no, I put myself in that position. But God had mercy. See, we should talk about this like the psalmist does in Psalm 136. You don't have to turn there, but you remember Psalm 136? The psalmist recounts the history of Israel, and in every verse he adds this phrase. It ends with the phrase, for the loving kindness of the Lord endures forever. That's the word chesed, or where we get the word idea for mercy, the loving kindness. And the psalmist goes through and says, we were in Egypt, but the loving kindness of the Lord endures forever. He brought us out, for the loving kindness of the Lord endures forever. We crossed the Red Sea, for the loving kindness of the Lord endures forever. They looked at every scene and every step and every moment and recognized the loving kindness of God. My friends, do we do that? When you hit 3 green lights on a row on the way to work, you should say, for the loving kindness of the Lord endures forever. You eat too much on Mother's Day, get on the scale, you only gained a pound, for the loving kindness of the Lord endures forever. You fix the leaky pipe on the first try, for the loving kindness of the Lord endures forever. Listen, what does Scripture say? Let him that boasts, let him boast in his luck. No, let him boast in the Lord. In the Lord, in his mercy, in his kindness, and in his little graces, and in his little blessings that he shows us day by day. You know, I think sometimes we talk ourselves out of this. We don't rely on God's mercy as we should. You know, we've been talking about evangelism a lot as a church, having some special sessions and so forth. I think sometimes, I know in my own life, there have been times when I shy away from evangelism because I've thought to myself, I don't want to mess things up. I don't want to mess this person up. Well, first of all, if they're dead in your sins, you can't make them more dead in their sins, all right? Let's start there. The only way is up, right from that. But one of the things that we do is say, man, I just don't know if I'm going to say the right thing. I might fumble my words. I might not remember a verse. My friends, do you know why a person gets saved? Romans 9 says it's not because of the one who wills or the one who runs, but on God who has mercy. He can use your fumbled up conversations by his mercy. He can use your less than perfect testimony by his mercy. He can use those frazzled moments when you don't feel like you know what's going on, your hardships and your trials, by his mercy. My friends, do you recognize the mercy of God? God's mercy is at work in so many ways that, again, our lives just kind of go through and go, oh, well, that's interesting. Oh, that just happened. No, that is God's mercy. You know how many times when I'm standing up here preaching, as I'm talking, I think to myself, that was the stupidest thing a human being, you didn't think that out. Why didn't you study that? And I'm sitting here thinking this, going, oh, that's so confusing. That doesn't help anybody, right? And guess what? You still keep coming up to me and going, man, God taught me something. That's not because of me. That is despite me. That is the mercy of Christ taking a feeble attempt to explain his perfect word to imperfect people. That is God's mercy. Do we recognize it? Do we celebrate it? Do we lean on his mercy? Maybe you're here this morning and you got yourself in a jam. You've got yourself in a tough situation. You got yourself in a tough spot in life or in work or in marriage or whatever. You're thinking, man, it's too late. Man, God is just angry with me. I've blown it. My friends, listen, it is not too late for God's mercy. Throw yourself on His mercy. Come to Him. Hebrews tells us, let us approach God's throne of grace with confidence so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in our time of need. If you are needy this morning, listen, His mercy is available to you. Come to Him. See, the greatest picture and the greatest assurance of God's mercy is seen in the cross of Calvary. That's why Jesus came. That's why Jesus died. That's why Jesus bled and was buried and rose again. Why? Because God is a merciful God. He has shown us His kindness, His grace. As Ephesians 2 says, for because of His great love for us, God, who is rich in mercy, made us alive with Christ even when we were dead in our sins. Listen, if you are a Christian here this morning, that's not because you're smarter than unbelievers. That's not because you're lucky. It's because God is merciful. And my friends, every one of us is in need of that mercy. We depend on that mercy. And we should recognize and celebrate that mercy. So do you talk like that? Like David. Surely goodness and mercy will follow me all the days of my life. Even the days when you're knuckleheaded and boneheaded and pinheaded and hot-headed. His mercy is present in those days. Celebrate His mercy. Recognize His mercy. And then, my friends, show His mercy, for as Jesus said, blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy.